Thank you, Sheila. I'm very proud to join in with my fellow Americans to present a different perspective on US-China relations. Our position is not one that you hear of or read about every day from the mainstream media, because these days you only hear negative things about China. Well, in the US, 80% of our media is owned and controlled by a few corporations, 6 of them in total. But they have their own agenda, of course. But today, we hope you will keep an open mind and hear a different perspective on US-China issues from us. We are a small voice, but we are the voices of many Asians, Blacks, Caucasians, Muslims, Latinos, and LGBTQ communities who are united in one belief that the direction which our government is taking brings us dangerously close to war with China and is wrong. For my part, I will focus my discussion on how our government's policies are affecting Chinese Americans adversely. The recent killing of George Floyd by a white policeman reminded me and many Chinese Americans of a brutal murder of a Chinese American man named Vincent Chin that happened in 1982 in Detroit, Michigan. Vincent Chin was killed by 2 white unemployed auto workers who mistook him for Japanese from Japan. They blamed him for the unemployment in the US auto industry because Americans were at that time shunning US-made cars for Japanese cars, which are cheaper and more efficient. The 2 white men were convicted of murder and sentenced by a white male judge to pay a small fine and put on probation without serving 1 day in prison. Vincent's murder has since become a rallying call for racial and judicial justice for Chinese Americans. It is now 2020, and it is China's turn to be blamed for a loss of jobs in the US when American corporations moved their manufacturing to China for better profits. And when the pandemic hit the US, President Trump failed to protect Americans, but he used China as a scapegoat and incites racial hysteria by using slurs such as Chinese virus and Kung flu. The Chinese Americans felt the sting of the demonizing of China in the press and by the administration. Some argued that Chinese Americans should not be conflated with China or its people, and urged Americans to separate Chinese Americans from China. I even heard a speaker recently from a webinar on racism against Asians, sponsored by APA, that Americans should blame the Chinese Communist Party and not China. These kinds of political juxtapositions are naive and damaging to our fight against racism at home. Because history and facts have shown that the rights and welfare of Chinese Americans are inextricably tied to the volatile relations between China and the US, and promoting anti-communist hysteria is an old trick that brought us the last Cold War with China in the 40s, in which Chinese Americans were the major victims in America. When news of the virus hit China in January 2020, and before the shelter-in took place, Chinese American-owned businesses such as restaurants and retails fell 70%. Hate crimes against Asian Americans took a sharp rise. They reported physical assaults, spitting, name-calling, and children being bullied in schools. Director of FBI Christopher Wray, who was appointed by Trump, considered every Chinese person in the US, especially the researchers and scientists, a part of a quote unquote whole of society spying for China. Anti-China, anti-immigrant hysteria is pervasive throughout the Trump administration, and its discriminatory and racist effects do not distinguish Chinese Americans from China. The Congress currently has 100 bills pending, all targeting China with sanctions for how China governs its people and how it deals with its own domestic problems. These bills sound morally righteous, based on the premise that America has the duty and moral authority to dictate to China and other countries how to govern their own country. Many of you know about the National Security Act that was recently adopted by the Hong Kong government. Our president, and the US Congress responded immediately by issuing sanctions against Hong Kong and China. But did you know that about 2.9 million Hong Kong residents signed a petition in support of the National Security Act? Of course not, because Americans' mainstream media does not report things like this. These signatures by Hong Kong people carry the hope that some semblance of peace could be restored back to Hong Kong after murder, destruction, and rioting by the protesters that reigned terror over Hong Kong for the entire year of 2019 and continuing. A majority of the Hong Kong people wanted their peace and normalcy back. And maybe we should let Hong Kong, which is a region of China, and other countries resolve their own domestic problems. And maybe our president and Congress could spend more time then in dealing with our own domestic issues, such as the pandemic, racism, and huge disparity between the rich and the poor. According to the polls, Americans have never viewed China more negatively than now. Roughly 2/3 or 66% of Americans have an unfavorable view of China, up nearly 20% points since Trump took office. This kind of sentiment carries huge implications for a climate ripe for war with China, which should be a great concern for all Americans. Now, can a new administration, such as one led by Mr. Biden, the Democratic Party challenger to Trump, change the narrative on China? Can he do better for Americans and make lives easier for Chinese Americans who have to live with the fallout from a US-China discourse? Our communities are asking. We need a roadmap to peace and not war. We need genuine leadership in this country, not politicians panning to the voters. And we need courage as a country to acknowledge the world order may be different, but war is never the answer. And with determination and support from a president who has the courage to change the terrible state that we're in, we may be able to turn the conflicts with China to our advantage without the need to go to war with China. And fundamentally, can we be strong enough to respect China's right to sovereignty over her regions as we expect her to respect ours? If we insist on peace, we will get peace. If we insist on war, we will get war. Can we choose peace together? Thank you so much.